Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate the fact that you took time out of your Saturday, a very rainy and cold Saturday, to come and join us for this Ottawa launch of The Letters, Postmarked, Prejudice in Black and White, a biographical novel by the amazing Sheila White. Yes, we can applaud. And I'm particularly grateful because I saw the launch in Toronto and I was jealous, and I said, why can't Ottawa have one too? And she obliged, and here she is. So to begin, I would like to ask Reverend Paul Dillman, our amazing minister at Riverside United Church, to give us a few words of welcome.
Welcome to Riverside United Church, and we are pleased to be offering space today for this event. One of our phrases in our vision purpose statement is that we seek to build partnerships of mutuality, respect, and hope in our neighborhood and beyond. And so I think this is one of those cases where we are offering space and time to build partnership in the community. It's a busy weekend here. I'm just going to do a brief commercial. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock is our 20th annual Jamaica night. If you want to know more about that, you can talk to me afterwards. So we are pleased to welcome Sheila White here, as well as Ian and Rosemary Shiller, the publishers. Sheila's brother, Chris, who's also here today, a few years before COVID, led some singing groups here. And one day, I overheard him talk about his Aunt Portia. And I went running in and I said, "Are you Portia White's nephew?" Because I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and I learned growing up about Portia, but particularly her brother, so another one of Sheila and Chris's uncles, Lorne, who was also a wonderful singer on Sing Along Jubilee, but also a regular guest soloist at church events when I was growing up. Even though he was Baptist, we invited him to United Church events a lot. So after this conversation with Chris, I told my mother about this connection, and she said, "Oh, well, Portia and Lauren's sister Yvonne was my grade 11 chemistry lab partner." And so the connections just keep building. And a few years ago, when Chris was in Halifax, he went and led music at the retirement home my mother lives in. And in the course of that conversation and at dinner, met some of the residents in the home, in the residence at Harris Hall, who also grew up in Dartmouth and knew Vivian and knew the story of Vivian's marriage to Bill. So that's what the story that we gathered today to learn more about. In July this year, Chris dropped in, hadn't seen him for a while. He told me about this book that his sister had written, and then he was heading to Toronto for the book launch. I said, "Well, get me a copy." And I said, "And if you want to have a launch in Ottawa, space is available here." So that's how we're here. So welcome to everybody, and because I got the book in July, I've read it and highly recommend it.
Wow, thanks so much. It's amazing, all those connections and coincidences. So is everybody ready to have a good time and to learn and to be awed by some of what you're going to hear? Are you ready? Yeah, I am. So look around at the memorabilia over there, which I sort of peeked at quickly, and it's like going back in time. Every item on display authenticates some part of the story Sheila has written. Sheila is the younger sister of the Chris that the pastor was talking about, Chris White. How many of you know Chris White? That's what I thought. He's kind of a famous guy. Very well known in festival, in the festival sector, and also in the media, because he's at CKCU hosting a show at the same time as my show. So I can't listen to your show, Chris. Anyway, this is his story as well, because it's about their parents. Incidentally, Chris shares his thoughts in the books afterward. So your exploration of the display materials is welcome and encouraged. Just a few housekeeping rules. So while you're looking at the display items, please handle with care. I don't know if you've looked at some of the pages, especially the manuscript ones. They're yellowed and they look really delicate. Yeah, please handle with care. And if you read a letter and it's in an envelope, please put it back in that envelope, right? And also put it back in the slot where you found it, because these items are placed in a specific order. And of course, please turn the pages carefully so that things don't tear and get ripped. And also, photographs. Don't in the middle. Handle, use the edge if you have to touch the photo, just the edges. And please do sign the guest book and leave comments after you've visited the display. Pastor has an announcement that the Sunday morning service tomorrow here at Riverside United Church at 10:30 a.m. will include a conversation between Sheila and Reverend Paul Dillman. And she and Chris will be performing some musical selections as well. So if you weren't planning to come to church, here's some incentive. I'm just saying. Photographs, videos, and recordings today are permitted, so feel free to share your images with the publisher, ed@yorklandpublishing.com, who is our first speaker. So come on up to say a few words.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank all of you for joining in the celebration of Sheila's remarkable achievement. Of course, we wouldn't be here today if it were not for the Reverend Paul Dillman, Church Administrator Louise Madère, and the congregation of the Riverside United Church, who graciously allowed us to use this venue, and for their tireless efforts of so many of you who have helped create and promote this event. So, I'd like to give a shout out to Chris White, Gail and Ian Christensen, Angelina Cacciato, of course, our MC, Sarah Onyango of Black History Ottawa on the radio station, Nathaniel Newton, and Maria Hawkins of CKCU 93.1 FM, and to Joanna Situ and Rohan Joshi, of Rogers. Now, from the moment that Sheila and Rosemary Shiller, the letter's editor, and I first discussed the possibility of a book, the project promised to become really a beacon of hope, especially today when bigotry is on the rise and democracy and social justice are under siege. The letters is an uplifting affirmation that the goodness within any of us can overcome the evil perpetrated by the misguided and the malevolent. It's a reminder that the struggle for social justice never ends, that any progress thus far attained, including Vivian and Bill's contribution, can only be sustained through constant vigilance, and that complacency inevitably leads to regression. The letters reassures us, too, that we, too, can make a palpable contribution, regardless of how big or small that contribution may be, to meeting the existential challenges of our age. The letters exemplifies the golden rule. When Vivian and Bill responded to those who perpetrated bigotry and hatred, not with anger or violence, but with compassion and understanding, with courage and conviction. And with the publication of this beautiful piece of literature, the letter's shining ray of hope can enlighten us all. So I really hope you read it, benefit from it, share it with your friends and relatives, and let it become a part of your everyday life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed Shiller of Yorkland Publishing, publisher of this book. I was very rude at the beginning. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm actually here representing Black History Ottawa. Black History Ottawa is, yes, Black History Ottawa is one of the partner organizations, and we, at our events, have had the opportunity to coordinate the Ottawa launch of most of the Black History stamps by Canada Post, and one of them was Viola Desmond, who I think is a relative as well. Is she? No, not. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yes. So this story obviously is of great interest to us, given the mandate of our organization. So I'm going to briefly introduce Sheila, because if I were to introduce her fully, it would take a day and a half, maybe. And then I'm going to just give you an idea of what's going to happen. So she is going to give us an overview using some slides and Riverside's technician, and then she will read a 12-minute excerpt. After that, she will answer any questions you may have, and she is going to wrap it all up with some special audio tracks where she will be helped by Chris and get all of you to sing along, just like their father did. Somebody talked about his singing. Yes, and Chris seems to have inherited that love of getting people to sing along, because music really is an important theme throughout this book. Sheila White. Sheila White is a writer, musician, songwriter, environmentalist, lay chaplain, political advisor, community leader, and volunteer. I'm exhausted just reading all that. She has worn many hats, as you will know, and today she's here as the author of her first novel. Please welcome. Wait, no, what I didn't. I don't know, I was just so excited to hear from you, but her work has won her accolades that are worth mentioning for sure. The 2022 Queen's Platinum Jubilee Medal from the province of Nova Scotia. She's a 2022 member of the National Apology Advisory Committee, looking at the World War I anti-Black racism, and chair of communications and community engagement. That was for the national apology that happened on July 9th, 2022. I'm sure you all saw that on TV. So she was on the advisory board for that. 2022 People's Choice Urban Hero Award winner in the environment category. 2018 Canada 150 medal recipient for outstanding contributions to community. The 2014 African Canadian Achievement Award in the politics category, and on and on. And there I'm really exhausted because on top of the work and roles, the achievement. Without further ado, please welcome Sheila Catherine White.
Thank you, Sarah, and I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Ottawa for coming out for this, and I wanted to make a few announcements of things that I've discovered in my journey as being an author. The first of which is, after you've published a book and you're officially an author, you immediately become a salesperson and a marketer. So I encourage you all to purchase a copy of my book or recommend it to friends. And if you really like the book, I also discovered recently that the best thing you can do for the author is to write a review on Amazon. Find that book, write your review, because if I collect 50 positive reviews, Amazon will take me more seriously, and then I will be more successful as a salesperson. I think that was the only housekeeping note I had to mention. Oh yes, there was one other, and Reverend Paul, you might get a kick out of this, because what I'm about to say was inspired by what a minister told his congregation when he was in the middle of a fundraising drive. And I'm going to borrow those words and say the same thing to you about my book, which is, we have all the money we need. This is good news. We have all the money we need to go into a third printing of the book, which is great news. The bad news is, we have all the money we need, but the bad news is it's in your pockets. So, I can see that Paul can relate to that. So we're going to start with our slideshow, and Ed's going to run the slides for me. And here, the first slide, after the cover slide, there they are, the letters. Yeah. The letters, and they're framed at the back. There are a few excerpts from the actual letters you can pull into the sleeve and read what people were saying about my mother marrying my black father. And you'll see a poem above the letters that he wrote to her, urging her to show him one of the letters. And you'll see the importance of Canada Post. You know, Canada Post delivered mail twice a day and on Saturdays. And it really was the main way people had to communicate with each other. My parents were exchanging letters back and forth, and you can leaf through all their correspondence as well. It also brought home to me the importance of the printed word, because we're in an era where we all receive texts and emails and we delete, and a lot of this stuff we're not going to be able to find again or conjure up, or our computer's going to crash and our data will be lost. But with a letter, it's there, as my title of the book says, in black and white. And for young people who don't know cursive, this should be an incentive to learn, because there's so much history attached to the printed word and to letters that people write to each other. And the other observation I'll make about the letters is they were largely racist in content. But in those days, they would put their name on letters. You know, today we're in an era of anonymity, where anybody can say any trashy thing without even using their real name or signing their declaration that they're owning up to their opinions. And so I thought it was very interesting that racism was so entrenched in those days that people would actually put their name on these sentiments. So we're going to start with talking about Vivian White, Vivian's mother. I should start by saying my parents were Vivian Keeler from Dartmouth and Billy White from Halifax. And Vivian's family, her mother, Jean Keeler, came from the Harlow family, and there's a great deal to be said about the Harlows in the display. And her father, Glenn Harlan Keeler, was a war hero in the First World War. He ended up with the 85th Battalion. He served the entire course of the war, 5 years, and survived, lived to tell about it, but he did succumb to war, being gassed, and died prematurely as a result at the age of 42. But he had incredible strength of character. One of the things he did was he wrote letters home to his mother, which of course I still have, because my mother was a chronic collector of everything informative. And he also kept a diary, a photograph album, and memoirs of his experiences in the First World War. And I think he was an incredible influence on Vivian. I keep doing this with my glasses on and off. I think it was an incredible influence on Vivian. He had a strength of character. And I also think another influence on her was her grandfather. She spent a year and a half living with her grandparents in North Brookfield, Nova Scotia, when her father was in the sanatorium, really struggling with his lung disease. Now, her grandfather, Morris Harlow, was a prominent citizen in North Brookfield. He kept a diary as well, from 1877 to 1935, every day. And those diaries are in the Heritage Museum in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. He recorded births and deaths. He recorded the weather every day, all the prominent occasions, elections, fall fairs. It's all in there, and it's my mother transcribed those diaries with the help of her cousin. So 68 years worth of diaries, and they are now available. If anyone's interested, I want to say if my book purchasers are interested in anything I say today, I can back it up if you get in touch with Ed at yorklandpublishing.com. He'll let me know what you're interested in, and I will send you all the background material, all the research. You know, we had to edit 30,000 words out of the book, so you can imagine there was a lot more to be said. And if there's anything you're curious about, again, I will say I invite you to explore the material with me. So that was Vivian's family, Jean and Glenn. And now we're on to Billy's family. Andrew, William Andrew White, who was a Reverend. He was the chaplain for No. 2 Construction Battalion, and he was a minister at Cornwallis Church, which has now been renamed to the New Horizons Baptist Church. But all these accomplishments over these years merited him to be deemed a person of historical significance by the Government of Canada. He was revered and influential, as I said, a war hero. And his teenage bride, Izie, was musically gifted, a devout wife. And in fact, a student at McMaster University in Hamilton has just completed his thesis on William Andrew White, and it's over there for you to peruse, his doctoral thesis. So Dr. Dudley Brown has concluded that William Andrew White had the same importance and same weight in history as Martin Luther King Jr. did in the United States. So there's a look at the battalion badge, No. 2 Construction Battalion, and Andrew White in his uniform. And I just wanted to show you that because, as Sarah mentioned, we did have the great event in Truro in July 2022. And I was chair of communications and community engagement. It was a 7-month process. We talked to people all over Canada with the government's question, which was, what does the government need to do to make this apology meaningful? And so we heard that it wasn't just the words of an apology, but there were concrete actions that would follow. And some of them have already happened. A coin was produced. A quilt is being made by the Nova Scotia Quilters Association, which will depict the valor and glory of No. 2 construction members. And we are renaming the sports field in Truro after No. 2 Construction Battalion. There's a number of monuments, and there's been a major overhaul of the education and information that's been available about this period of time. And many of the errors that had been previously written have been corrected now. So that's quite a bit, and there's more to come. The picture you're going to look at, oh yes, we have more on the construction battalion. Just a look at William Andrew in the mess hall with the fellow officers. It was a black segregated battalion, but all the officers except my grandfather were white. And there's a look at a photo that Izie sent to Andrew when he was serving in France in 1917. And the 6 children of the 13 that had been born at that time. And you can see their names from left to right. There was Helena, Portia, Billy, Nettie, Mildred, and to the right, the oldest boy, Romney, who did not live long after this shot. Within 2 years, he had died of an accident where he fell off the back of a truck, an open truck, and hit his head on a rock the day after Christmas in 1919. And as a result, the city of Halifax passed a bylaw that you couldn't ride in open trucks anymore. So now we're going to take a look at Billy and Vivian. What a dapper young student he was at Dalhousie. His father was able to scrape up enough money to enroll him in university, but unfortunately, within a couple of years, Andrew had died, and Billy had to quit school in order to support the family. And the picture on the right is Vivian Keeler. She was a stenographer, got her certificate from the Maritime Business College at the age of 18, and began working as a stenographer at the Wartime Prices and Trade Board in Halifax. And that's a picture of her sitting at her desk. So, Reverend Paul mentioned Yvonne. Yvonne is in the center of the front row there. She's 4 from the right, and Bill White, the choir director at Bloomfield High School, is in the back row. And he always formed and directed choirs. This was back in, 1944. But Bill White was known for his ability, and I would want to theorize that perhaps this wore off on Chris White, to get large groups of people singing together and having fun doing it. So I'll talk more about Dad's musical abilities later. Here he is, and his job at the YMCA in Halifax was the director of boys programming, and of course he formed a band, and he probably formed a choir. And that's a look at him and his band, and I just wanted to point out that there's both white and black members in that band. Yes, I should mention at this point that before my father met my mom, he worked for the Bill Lynch Carnival. With any Maritimer would know that was quite something to have travel to your town. And I have set up on the laptop at the back a slideshow of early Nova Scotia. So that's over there, and when you get a chance, take a look at some of those slides and you'll get a real feeling of the slice of life. The carnival slides are a completely different show. You'll have to have me back for that. So we're looking at Vivian now. Yes, Camp Owen is very important, both in the lives of Billy and Vivian. Vivian would go there with her friends, and Billy basically ran the camp. It was one of the many YMCA camps that he would tour around and be a recreation director and lead singing. This is an example of racial discrimination, although you wouldn't know it, and you can get a closer look at the display. But it's my father's military rejection notice from the Second World War. And he was a very healthy man, and he went to enlist. And he was rejected because of his color. We're going to take a look at the fellow on the right is George White, and he's responsible for Billy meeting Vivian. And there's a picture of the two of them. And I don't know if you can see that they're smoking cigarettes, but there was a lot of that going on in those days, and aren't we glad that it's kind of falling out of fashion. And as a litter prevention advocate, I wish it would completely fall out of fashion totally, like no more, but it was big in those days. The next slide is another band, and the arrow is pointing to Les Vipond, who also had an important part in this story because he was the executive director of the YMCA where my father worked, and he absolutely demonstrated the anti-racist philosophy that seemed to be flowing through that organization, and he went on to become a really big name in the YMCA. Now here's a picture of where Billy and Vivian first met, at Vader's drugstore lunch counter, where George was working in training to be, as he did become, a pharmacist. And the next slide is Vivian's boyfriend. You see, they were both seeing other people at the time. This was not just an immediate falling in love and getting together. There was a lot of push and pull before that actually happened. There was 19 chapters worth of push and pull. I kept asking myself as a writer, when am I going to get them out of Nova Scotia? Because there was a lot happening. So there's a picture of Dick Hill, and there on the right is a picture of Vivian being lifted up by Dick Hill and her future husband Billy at Camp Owen. So you have to read the book. The next slide is, I could say, these people inspired the writing of my novel. Ed, we're going to show some of Vivian's Harlow family members. aunts and uncles. There's Cousin Charles, Aunt Elsie, Uncle John, Uncle Walt. The Harlow name was very well known in that part of Nova Scotia. And as I mentioned, Vivian's maternal side relates to Harlows, and they are Mayflower Pilgrims. And there's a Harlow Family Association that's been in existence for 82 years. There's a fort that was founded by Sergeant William Harlow. It still stands. It's a museum now, and the Family Association helps to keep that going. And they have their reunions every year. So yes, that family inspired the book because they wrote the letters that you'll see on display. This is a piece of sheet music that my father figured he had to pull out all the stops to woo my mother, not only because she was seeing somebody else, but because of the difference in their skin colors. I think he realized he'd have to bump it up a notch, so he wrote her this beautiful song. And he hand designed the cover with what looks like her face looking into the distance. And at that point it was signed, "Sincerely, Billy." So they weren't quite there yet. But the words to the song and the original are in the book, and the original sheet music is there for you to look at. There's lots of poetry, original poetry, and clever creative stuff woven in through this story. That's a look at the next slide is a look at the copyright notice from 1946. So Billy was a serious musician trying to get known that way too. The next slide is some of the romantic backdrops. I don't know if the Maritimers here would know Dingle Road, Cogswell Road, the Martello Tower in Point Pleasant Park. But there are scenes set in these locales in the book. And the next is a September trip in 1946 that my parents took to Moncton. And that's a look at the train station, and you see Vivian's arm looped around Billy's. It's pretty clear by then they're serious. In fact, they had arranged now he was going to leave for a new job in Toronto, and she was going to follow him there. And the next is just a look at how happy my father was. Billy, happy and dapper. His nails were always perfectly manicured, his shoes were always well shined, and he looked great in his suits. I never saw him wear short sleeves really casually. He was always a long sleeve guy. The Montreal carriage shot I absolutely loved. So they met in Montreal before Billy came to meet Vivian in Montreal to take her to Toronto in November of 1946. And then he wrote a poem, and it's on the display table. It was cut from the book, you see. And I went to a book event at a bookstore in Peterborough, and they were asking me, well, what types of things did you cut from the book? And I said, well, we cut a limerick about my parents' trip from Montreal to Toronto. And the guy said, well, why would you cut a limerick? What? I said, well, it was 18 stanzas. So you can read all 18 stanzas over there. And this is a picture of Vivian at Billy's rooming house in Toronto on Lansdowne, 1421 Lansdowne, sort of in the west end of Toronto. And they lived with these amazing people, Curley and Cleo Christian. I'm going to tell you more about them. But again, writing a letter at her desk, at Billy's desk, they treated her like a daughter, the Christians. They opened their home to both Billy and Vivian. The importance of the printed word, I just want to get back to that because Vivian was such an avid correspondent all her life, and we all benefited from that because we could save those things and recall them. This is a look at Vivian's diary. It too is on display, but I just wanted to show you her tiny, perfect writing. And I also wanted to point out that with her there was no wasted words. It was everything in there was informational and pertinent. And Vivian kept a diary for 35 years. I think she was trying to beat her grandfather's record, but she didn't quite make it. But because there was such a long string of continuous diaries, it caught the interest of the University of Toronto linguistics people. And when they found out that I had these diaries, they asked if they could study them. because Mom suffered dementia and eventually died from complications due to Alzheimer's. And she kept that diary until about 5 months before she died. So the researchers were able to compare young Vivian with the healthy brain and the aging Vivian with the plaque-filled brain and study the language changes that occurred. And they called it the Vivian White Project. It's an international study. And what it concluded, and this is very interesting too, they found that Vivian had the perfect diarist writing style. It's point form. They went here, danced it here. You use your verbs first. There's no pronouns. But as the dementia set in, the reliance on pronouns became vital. And the graduation was that pronouns became very important now. And she would be referring to she did this or he did this. So that in linguistic circles was significant. Who knows where it will lead? But that was some of the value of having the printed word and being able to turn over all the diaries to people who could research. The next day, we're going to go to 1946 now. This is November upon arrival. On Yonge Street, they used to have sidewalk photographers that would wait for people to walk by. They'd snap your picture and then sell it to you. And Vivian obviously liked what she saw, and who knows what it cost, maybe a quarter. But she purchased this photograph. And then on the other side is Billy with Vivian's landlord, George Phillips, and his wife were essential to her finding housing when she arrived. And that was one of the difficulties for this interracial couple that you'll read about in the book, was the difficulty finding housing once they found that there was a black person intending to live there. But the Phillipses weren't like that. And you'll read how both the Phillips family and the Christian family were ultra supportive. Landlord-tenant relations were different then. They would lend them money, they would lend them their car, they would counsel them. Vivian could stay over anytime she wanted, and Mrs. Christian would police, Billy so that make sure he slept on the Chesterfield and that Vivian had his bed. Now, the next thing we're going to look at are the Christians at their house on Lansdowne. And that's Cleo leaning on the railing. And behind her is Curley. Curley was a First World War hero. This is one of the most amazing chapters in the book, I think, is his story. So I don't want to give it all away, but I will tell you, he's the only quadriplegic from the First World War who was Canadian who survived losing 4 limbs. So no arms and no legs, but he went on to become a revered spokesperson for the War Amps organization. He fought for them to get pensions. He fought to get a headquarters built. He was very popular as well, and he loved to bet on the horses. And his reputation was such that he never had to pay to go to the racetrack. They just let him in. He was decorated by King Edward. So there's lots of great stuff to read. And that's taken from actual interviews that were done from the Châtelet magazine of 1946. The next slide is the Christian's son. He's standing there with his girlfriend and Curley on the left-hand photo, wearing the baseball uniform. Douglas Christian was the first black person in Toronto to be admitted into the Navy in the Second World War because he was rejected, but his father wasn't having none of that. He and Cleo drove to Hamilton. They met with the Navy minister, and they got Douglas in as the first. And there's my parents sitting on the step. They're going to be married soon, and you can tell they're very relaxed and happy with each other. Now we're going to look at the Home Service Association, which is where my father came to work from the Halifax Y. This was a community center that was predominantly serving black people, but all people, as you can see from the baseball team, multi-ethnic, and that was one of his duties, was to provide recreational activities, and he would supervise the baseball games. But there was so much more at that center, and you'll read how the Black community received support there, and how the City of Toronto worked with this community agency to make sure that citizens were getting the services they needed, because the city itself wasn't doing such a great job of it. And now, I'm very excited about this portion of the book. The program annual of the United Church in 1946. My father was, a number of luminaries of the day were approached to contribute to the young people's educational programming, which was housed in this book. And on page 68, you'll see my father's article and workshop guideline, "Pardon Me, Your Prejudice," is showing. And it's a series of exercises that takes people through various questions and thoughts that they can talk about in discussion groups. And Mom and Dad went around shopping this to what was called fireside chats. All the churches would have firesides. And so they'd go to the firesides and work with the young people on these race relations exercises. And it just goes to show you that even back in 1946, the United Church had a significant role to play in community building. And yes, I'll leave it there. The United Church was instrumental through the efforts of Reverend Alvin Cooper, who was the architect of this book. This poem you're seeing is actually a poem to Al Cooper. Usually I read it, but I'm not going to do that today. It's on the display table. But it's really clever, and it got cut from the book. But every word at the end of the sentence rhymes with Asian. So all those last words rhyme with Asian. So it's just another example of how creative my father was. Certificate of marriage, yay! United Church, again, comes through with flying colors. College Street United Church. And there's the certificate that legalized the whole thing on June 23rd, 1947. I'm not going to tell you about their consultations with the minister and what people had to say about it, and how the ceremony went or the preparations, because that's all in the story. I wanted to just take a sidestep and mention that this display is my third display on various topics. The first one was in 2018. It's called Portia White, Celebrating 50 Years On, and it was done in 2018 because that was the 50th anniversary of her death in 1968. And that was very well received, and from there we got a call from the Truro Museum, the Colchester Historium, to take our display there, and then eventually now it's at the Black Cultural Center as a permanent home. And the other display was the First World War exhibit we did in 2019, Keepsakes and Propaganda, and that was featuring those letters I told you about, the Glenn Keeler's letters home, and the memorabilia, the photo albums, memoirs, and even the spurs of his horse, Tommy. So we had a really great display there too. And all this just to say that by having these materials, it really enlivens and gives a special essence to stories. Now, this is the College Street United Church where they were married, and that picture was taken a few years after. There's the wedding party, and on the left is Douglas Christian. He was one of the ushers. Bill and Vivian's best friends, Harold and Helen Kieran, stood up for them. But there was an incredible difficulty finding someone to give away the bride. So that's another aspect that our book will cover. Ed? There they are. My mother said it was just perfect. That's in quotes from her diary. And there they are in the days when they still threw confetti at weddings. And again, as a litter prevention activist, I'm glad that trend's gone too. Now this is a beautiful home on 1 Elm Street. It still stands. It's owned now by Branksome Hall Private School for Girls. But how did they end up living there? A mixed couple. It was a fluke. I can't tell you how, but you'll read about it in the book. But they had a wonderful flat there overlooking the Rosedale Valley. And it was just so wonderful for my mother to have that pressure relieved, because that was her biggest worry. When they placed an ad for looking for an apartment, they had to stipulate that a quote-unquote Negro would be living there, just so that to weed out the prospect of appearing at the door. This is my mother used to say, they'd go to the door, and as soon as they saw Billy, oh, I'm sorry, that apartment's just been let. There's an overlook of the Rosedale Ravine. I love that picture just because there's no condos in it. That's just me, but they really had a beautiful setting to start out their marriage. There's Chris and my older brother, Romney, and bringing him home from the hospital in July of 1948. This is the next place my parents, they lived on Bloor Street temporarily, but this is the next permanent home they had on Lonsmount Drive in Forest Hill with a couple named Avis and Jarvis McCurdy, who were amazing people. He was a university professor at U of T. They'd already traveled the world. They did that right after they got married. He had his degree in divinities and psychology. She was a secretary at the First Unitarian Church, and they were both members of the C.C.F, the forerunner political party to the NDP. And what a house it was. They had many different apartments in there. They used to have square dancing in the dining room. They would have people come over and do book launches and book reviews, discussions with authors and artists. They had many, many noise complaints and visits from the police. That's Vivian's brother, Bernard. He wrote one of the letters in the frame. Can you back up a bit? And he's holding Romney, and you notice he has a broken arm. That's how he came to visit his sister, because they had no use for him on the farm where he was working a summer job. So he thought he'd take a side trip with his broken arm to visit his sister. And he'd long since recanted whatever he wrote in that letter. And they were always very close. But the interesting thing about Bernard and the McCurdys is he ended up marrying into the family. So, yeah, so that's a close connection that you will read about. I also want to say about that broken arm thing, as soon as his mother, Jean, found out that he was visiting his sister, she demanded and ordered him to come home. So he had to cut the trip short. So she was still a little sour at that point. You see, she did disown her daughter for a while. My father did run for the C.C.F. in 1949 as the first black person in Canada to seek a seat in Parliament. And there he is standing with David Lewis, which that man was his inspiration. David Lewis, the great national secretary of the C.C.F. And at the time he was going around Ontario lecturing about socialism and the values of it. And he was very supportive of my father's candidacy. That's an election poster you'll see on the table, and when you turn it over, you have the next slide, you'll see it was translated into Yiddish. And I like to say that this is an example of the original black Jewish dialogue that now occurs on a regular basis. When he gave his campaign speeches, they would translate them into Yiddish because that's the language the audience in Spadina predominantly spoke. And there's also a campaign leaflet there and articles, a scrapbook of articles from newspapers about the federal campaign and what the issues were. And I've gone through there and I see a lot of similarities. You know, there's still the same issues: equality, jobs, income disparity. So I hope you enjoy leafing through that. This is in Lonsmount, and that's my sister Lori. She's 4 years older than I am. And I just thought that was a particularly nice picture of their setup there. And they have all the people and things set up on the bookcase that mean something to them, and they're just starting to build a home. And I also want to draw attention to all the books, because Billy had a lot of books. Very well read. Both my parents were extremely intelligent. And I think that's what helped them through this crisis too. So you have to be a thinking person and critically thinking person, and have a resolve in yourself that what you're doing is sound and right and loving. So now we're looking at the family that's come together again. This would have been 1956, I think. 1955. The little baby, that's me. Who can guess which one's Chris? Chris is to my, well, if you're looking at the picture, he's to my left. So from left to right, we have my sister Laurie, then we have Chris, and we have me sitting on Brother Romney's knee, and then we have Jean, who we knew as Nana, and you can see how lovingly she's looking at all of us. And behind her, I mentioned Dick Hill, Vivian's boyfriend. Those are his parents. The Hills were always lifelong friends, and Dick Hill was a lifelong friend of the families as well. And there's my dad looking a little bit pouty face. And I'm going, I wonder if that has anything to do with what had transpired beforehand. You know, he's sitting behind the woman who made his life miserable for a number of months or years. So I just wonder what that expression is telling us. And this is Billy on the S S Cayuga. We're moving forward in time now, but he was always at the piano. He was always drawing people around him in a musical spirit. And this was no exception. I'm imagining this is when he was working for the John Ingalls company, appliance making company, and this perhaps was one of their outings as a staff group, because he was the personnel director there and the director of the recreation club. And he's designed his own crossword puzzles for the newsletter. You'll see some examples of that in the display. And so next we have our house in Scarborough, Ontario, Agincourt to be specific, the village of Agincourt when it was still a village. And I had that house preserved at my mother's behest under the Ontario Heritage Act so that it can never be torn down. And 6 of the 8 trees you see there still have protection. They're now 125-year-old Norway spruces. And so there are the key couple and the brother who introduced them and the brother who was a lifelong friend, Bernie, Bill, Vivian, and George in front of what we called the White House. And technically, under the Ontario Heritage designation, it is called the Harris White House. The Harris were the pioneers that built the house. The Whites were the family that lived there and accomplished so much for 62 years. But don't Google Harris White House because of Kamala Harris and White House. You won't find that. If you want the link to the fascinating report about the history of the house, again, contact Ed at yorklandpublishing.com, and I'm willing to share all this stuff. That includes Glenn Keeler's letters home about First World War, anything you're interested in. Because if this material is not shared, it really doesn't have any value. And that's why I'm so happy to be able to bring it to life at a forum such as this. This next shot is Billy and his siblings, the ones, some of them are mentioned in the book. Mildred, Jack, and the great Portia White, also a federally designated person of historical significance. Jack White will be having a plaque unveiled to him by Heritage Toronto next April 2024 because he was a labor leader of distinction, and there's a whole story behind that I don't have time to tell you now. But Billy came from a very prolific family, and that continues down the line. And you know, Senator Donald Oliver is a member of our family, and George Elliott Clark is a member of the family, and on it goes. Chris White is a member of the family. You see where I'm going with that. There he is leading singing, and the happy looks on all those faces. We're going to recreate a scene like that soon because I have audio tracks from back in the day where Billy is leading singing, and he leads swing low in 4-part harmony, and we're going to try to recreate that experience. When he was recreation director at John Ingalls, he arranged for Portia to give a recital there. And one of his other skills was poster painting. And I have clear recollections of all the whiteboards being laid out in the dining room and how he lined it up first in pencil and then he would do it. He tried to show me how to properly hold a paintbrush. So if anybody's interested, I have the technique, but I wasn't able to employ it. But there he is, with the perfect lettering of the art exhibit. And now we're nearing the end of the presentation. This is his investiture into the Order of Canada. We have an Order of Canada display where you can look at the program. You can read my mother's description of the event, who was there. I'll give you a hint, Gordon Lightfoot was there and sat at their table. And so there he is getting the award. And there he is standing with one of the co-recipients, Harry Jerome, the great Canadian sprinter, now passed, but they were together at that event. And finally, slide of my mother and me. And so before I wrote the book, I polled all my siblings to build character profiles of my parents, because it wasn't just my recollection. To be honest, I didn't ask a lot of questions. I didn't take a lot of interest in my younger years in any of this stuff. So I asked them to come up with some character traits, and everybody fed in, and I wanted to read you what they said about Vivian, because in my mind, as accomplished as my father is and everything he's done, she is the hero of my story, because she had the strength of purpose and conviction to know that marrying him was the right thing to do. And that's why I'm here. So how can I not be happy? So this is what my siblings said to close off about Vivian White. Love of family, idealistic, nature-loving, environmentalist, loving, conscientious, determined, persistent, music-loving. And I'll stop there to say my mother hosted house concerts at our heritage home and brought all the Canadian artists in and helped them sell CDs and filled our living room and brought people in to support them, sold tickets, all that stuff. So music-loving and loved bringing people together. Committed, community-oriented, shy, stubborn, honest, dutiful, self-deprecating, intrepid, judgmental, pragmatic, deliberate, ecologically minded, tenacious, gentle, trusting, introverted, cause-driven, methodical, intelligent, beautiful, ethical, industrious, thrifty, modest, and imaginative. Well, what a package. You know, I'm so proud and indebted to my mother. So that's my presentation. I think we're going to move on to some audio tracks. Sarah, what's next on our plan?
Stay here. Yeah. Don't go too far. This is the part where the audience that has absorbed all of this incredible slice of history and Canadian life gets to ask burning questions that were going through their minds during this presentation, because it's very visual too. So if you have any questions, there's a roaming mic, so you don't have to.
There's a hand up at the back.
Yeah, so you can just put your hand up, and then you can come.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Sheila. I just wanted to know, what's your relationship with Portia White? Is she your aunt?
Yes, she's my father's sister. She's my paternal aunt. If you go to portiawhite.ca, I set up a website of all the artifacts that are in the Portia White exhibit. So if that's of interest to anyone, there is a website there you can peruse. And hear some never before heard tracks of her singing.
So, you just name dropped some famous relatives, White, etc. Did your father ever remind you and your siblings of the White name, what it means, and the birth of that name, if at all? Because in some families, you have, you are so-and-so, there's a certain way you're expected to achieve, behave, etc. Did your father?
I don't think we got that talk, did we, Chris? It was just expected, and Yeah, not really. What can I say about that? I really got a sense of this stuff after 1984 when my Uncle Jack White got the idea that he should bring the Canadian and American families together, because Andrew, my grandfather, was the only one of his Virginian family to come to Canada. So the Canadian Whites were quite separate and we didn't know a lot about our history. So he arranged with some American relatives to bring us all together, and we started having biennial reunions. And that's when the history started to seep in. Like, we didn't get to talk about Andrew White was, my dad wouldn't say, well, my father was a famous chaplain in number 2 construction battalion. I don't think that was ever mentioned. We didn't get a lot of that. And I didn't ask the questions, as I say in my foreword. If I'd asked the questions, this would be a book of nonfiction. But because I had to fill in some gaps and invent a few things to bring the story together, we call it faction, not fiction.
I've been wondering about Andrew and
Izie.
And where all those black folks in Nova Scotia came from. Do you know much of that?
I know Andrew's better than Izie's. I know Izie was part of the Black Loyalist migration, and she lived in Mill Village, but she didn't talk about her past, her childhood, her parents. I don't know anything about that. One of my cousins has tried to get into some research and didn't get very far. And she was out of Mill Village at the age of 16 is when she married my grandfather. And by the time I came along, she was on her 3rd husband. So we weren't really talking about the 1st husband anymore. So Andrew hailed from Virginia, and he went to a seminary school in Washington, and from there he met a teacher who had attended Acadia, and her name was Helena Blackadar. She was only there at the seminary for 4 years, at the same time as Andrew was, but he heard about Acadia, and she wrote a letter to see if they'd accept a colored boy, and they said they would. So he became the 2nd black person to enroll in Acadia, and from there he got his doctorate or his degree in divinities and became a Baptist minister. But no, all the history of the other whites is just as prolific as ours, and in their own locale. So it's a good thing that we were brought together by those reunions to learn all this stuff. And the other thing we did was in 2007, Johns Hopkins University was running tests, because I always wondered where I really came from, like it wasn't Virginia. And to find that out, they could do DNA testing on the saliva of the oldest maternal relative and the oldest paternal side relative. So they did that. My brother Romney was the paternal guy, he provided his saliva test, and they were able to tell us where in Africa we came from, which is Ghana and Cameroon. And I just thought that was so cool to know that. And I point out in the book how unfortunate, like Vivian could go back 12 generations and know her history from the times the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. And Bill was 2 generations away from slavery. Is that fair that you cut off somebody's lineage and that you don't know any of the answers to these questions? That's what was going through my mind.
That your parents, wherever they are, down in your wrist and smile. Can you tell me how did the family dynamic between your paternal side and maternal side, how did that impact on you as a child?
It didn't really. I mean, this was my mother's narrative to all her children as soon as we were old enough to understand that her mother didn't want her to marry a black man, and that they'd written all these horrible letters. So, but that was all water under the bridge by the time I came along, and I talk about in the book how that was resolved and everybody came together. And as a matter of fact, when my grandmother Jean Keeler was dying, it was my father's side, it was people like Lorne and Yvonne White who were singing by her bedside. So, everything worked out. It was just a matter of time and awareness and education that brought my grandmother around. She was just, and a lot of people, they were just spewing out stuff that they heard. They weren't being those critical thinkers I was talking about earlier. They weren't thinking about what they were saying. It didn't even have to make any sense. That was just what was said at the time. But once she got the experience of having children born into our family, and you know, what grandmother is going to turn her back on a newborn? So this was sort of the, children are the answer to racism. You know, this is one of the conclusions I came to, because as young people come up, and as we are born, we do not harbor any kind of prejudice or racism. We learn it. So it's really important that the young voices are trained properly and given the right information. And when we come along, we can soften some of the hardliners who are on the wrong track.
I have more of an observation than a question. You said your father was, in many respects, similar to Martin Luther King. I've never heard of your father ever before. What kinds of things was your father doing during that period that would reflect the same kinds of things that Martin Luther King was doing?
Yes, and I do touch on this in the book as Billy's reflecting on his father. First of all, I didn't say he was our Martin Luther King. That was the conclusion of Dr. Dudley Brown, who did the year-and-a-half research to compose his thesis. And what he cites are things like, my grandfather would go around finding jobs for young men who couldn't find jobs. He would visit employers and encourage them, implore them to hire one or two of his people. He would gather up donations of bread from bakeries and disperse that to the community. He was an advocate for better education. You know, he was sitting around the table on all those important discussions, and he rose to the rank of secretary of the Eastern Baptist organization. Like, he was very high up, and the executive members always looked forward to his annual speeches because he was so funny and he was, you know, so articulate. And I think it was just his helping ability. And he had a radio show that was significant as well. He had a weekly program that was broadcast all over the Maritimes and parts of the United States. And I did meet someone once, quite a while ago, who actually heard my grandfather speaking on the radio. And he said he had to pull over his vehicle and stop and listen to the whole thing. It was so powerful he couldn't listen to it while he was driving. He wanted to be still. So, and the other anecdote I have is from a woman who was a girl in Chester at the time when Andrew visited their bakery, and they gave him some bread. I'm sorry, they sent some bread to the church, and Andrew dropped by to say thank you. And this woman remembers her mother telling her that he was the only one of all the donations they'd made to charitable organizations. He was the only one who came to say thank you. So it was qualities like that that probably endeared him as well. I also heard from someone who heard him preach once that he didn't need a microphone, that the doors would be open to the church and people would stand on the sidewalk and they could still hear him. I don't know whether that's true. And I do know the account of his funeral, that the streets were lined with thousands of people, including all the higher-ups from, you know, the lieutenant governor was there, and all the higher-ups from the religious order were there. And, you know, there was a great sorrow at his passing. So that's about as much as I know. Like I say, my grandmother was on to her third husband. And even thinking about this now, why didn't I talk about my real grandfather? Because I called her third husband Grandpa as well, right? But there would be no occasion to do that. I wouldn't even think to do that because it would be uncomfortable for Grandpa, and probably my grandmother didn't want to think about her first husband anymore. I don't know why I didn't ask, but I wish I had. I wish I'd asked Grandma, where did you grow up? And this is what I say in my foreword to all young people who might read this book. Ask those questions, ask them now, and get the information, because it's really interesting and it's part of you and who you are. Any other questions? Oh, wait for the mic. I can't hear you though.
So, I finished my novel, but how old were you when you lived in Halifax?
I never lived in Halifax. I was born in Toronto in 1954, and all my siblings were born in Toronto. My parents... So the Halifax connection really comes from my parents, where my dad being born in Halifax and my mom being born in Dartmouth. And we went back there for summers every year for vacation to visit our relatives and that type of thing. And even in Toronto, there was a huge maritime community there, and they would have an annual Maritimers Night. Actually, I have a good memory from Maritimers Night if you have time. It was in a grand old church, I think it was St. George's Anglican. And once a year, all the people who were living in Toronto, who were from the Maritimes, would come and get together for a social. And each province would be represented by a different colored card. And my job as an 8-year-old was to go and give the cards out to the people from New Brunswick got the orange card, and the people from Nova Scotia got the green card, and PEI was blue, etc. And then collect all those cards in the box at the end, which I did. And then I got the idea, I'm going to put a secret note in the box. I'm going to say, whoever finds this note, would you please write to me? And I put it in the box, and I got a letter back from the church administrator. That was so exciting to me. Again, the printed word. Somebody found it and they responded, and we had a pleasant interaction as a result of that. So, yeah, that was a very good question. And I should have clarified that I'm not a Nova Scotian, although it's a beautiful place to live and visit.
Were you take a question?
One more.
Oh, I don't know. No, I can't take this guy's question. No. Chris, the answer is no.
This is a serious question, and this is my question, is, as you said, on our mom's side of the family, those people were reflecting the attitudes of the day, and they actually thought that they were doing the right thing by telling our mom not to make this mistake with her life and so on. So those were the prevailing attitudes of the day. It's not that our ancestors were more racist than other people's white ancestors, right? That was just what was in the water at the time, and the reality is still is, unfortunately. So here's my question that I have never solved for myself. How was it that our particular mother was able to withstand the pressure that was applied to her at the age of, what was she?
21.
21. And all those letters that we read in this book are pretty powerful.
Well,
pretty powerful statements
she
to somebody that was just getting started in life. How was she able to withstand that pressure and proceed?
Well, I think her intellect and her studies of other places since she was a girl, she was always fascinated with history and geography and things like that. But I think also, well, I get this from the Harlow Family Association at their reunion. I asked, in the course of researching my book, what are the distinguishing marks of a Harlow? And the first thing they said was stubborn. I think that helped. But I also think she just knew, like, when she read their opinions, she thought their minds were poisoned. She could just instantly see that. And plus she had our grandfather Harlow, Moss was his nickname, who was a very loving and kind and community-oriented guy, and she had her father who died when she was 11. And I'm sure she was convinced that her father would have supported her because of what she knew about him. And when you read the content of his First World War letters, you see what kind of person he was and the details he looked at and the people he cared about. And there was never a racist sentiment in any of those letters that I could see. So I think it was the male influences in her life and the conviction of this, stubborn streak, and also her well-informed status at the time. Having worked at the Wartime Prices and Trade Board, you're constantly looking at current events. Her mother worked at the Halifax Chronicle Herald, the newspaper, And so there was always information available to Vivian, and I just think she figured that out on her own in a miraculously timely way, like as a forerunner. So what do you think, Chris? I mean, you were here before I was.
Just say one thing that we add on to those would be the incredible intensity of the love between the two of them, which also comes out in the book, and that was obviously a big factor. Love. It can be struck forward.
Thank you very much for all your amazing questions. And I'm sure you have more, but there will be time after the formal part of the program to ask questions as you buy your book and get it autographed. Just saying. So this is the part where Chris comes up.
Yeah.
Because you guys have got a treat for us.
Okay, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to listen to Billy White. He's organizing a group. We're going to pull up an MP3, and you're going to hear how he would talk to people about the Negro spiritual. And you can play that now. And then he's going to sing a little passage so you can hear his singing voice.
The success of this evening will depend entirely on the degree to which you are prepared to participate. Because just to hear me sing about the Negro spirituals will not infuse in you this deep sense of emotion that can be evoked as you generate, as the sound of sound. And so I do sing, and you're going to sing, and we'll sing together and create an experience that will, I hope you're rewarding you. And so in this first group, we want to deal with songs that have to do with the Negro's preoccupation of heaven. And I'm going to sing one, which is called, I've heard of a city called Heaven, I'm trying to make my home. And I should have said to you too, that those of you who prefer to sing the soprano should really be singing on this side. And those of you who prefer to sing alto should be over on this side. And those of you who would rather sing tenor, and please over here, the sopranos, and all of you who are bass, let me see that those of you who sing bass. Sit on this side. If you're not sure what you sing, stay where you are. Okay, so the first song is I've heard a city called Heaven, and it doesn't disturb me if you over on while I'm singing.
cards together now. Got your card? Swing low, sweet chariot, come for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, come for to carry me home.
That is one of the most amazing presentations ever. I love it. We get to sing at the end. Oh my gosh, I've never experienced that. And it was really special to actually hear your dad's voice. Really, like in his element, teaching, the singing, and then him singing. What a bit. Now I know where Chris gets his voice from. His singing voice. Wow. Well, what an amazing event. You actually surpassed my expectations. And I'm really hoping that this is not a one-off and that you will be coming back to speak to university students and schools here in the Ottawa area. We rarely get this caliber of living history, presented to us. And wishing you a lot of success on your book tour, lots of book sales. And now you are invited to enjoy the display if you didn't get to see it, and buy some books. Save me one, please, because I need to buy a book. Thank you all very much for coming out in support of this book launch. You can give yourselves a hand. Thank you very much. Oh, and thank you to Riverside United Church for hosting. Pastor Bill, thank you very much. The president of Black History Ottawa is here, Jean Gervin. So shout out to Black History Ottawa for coming on board to support the event. Thank you, and everybody get home safe.